This is lecture 2 about the 70s, the period of the 70s, again, what your book calls the Unravelling. And after the resignation of Nixon, of course, Vice President Ford comes into office. And he's very interesting. Ford was the only president never to have been elected to the office and never been elected to vice president. He was appointed to replace Vice President Agnew, and he assumed the presidency when Nixon resigned. Okay, so he was never elected to either office. An economic crisis troubled his short administration, and certainly troubled the Carter administration afterwards. Ford named Nelson Rockefeller, former governor of New York, as his vice president. So, for the first time in history, both offices were occupied by persons for whom no one had voted. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, which prevented his prosecution for the obstruction of justice. And this proved to be a deeply unpopular decision. Ford had no significant accomplishments in domestic policy during his administration. He and his economic advisor, Alan Greenspan, wanted Americans to spend less and save more to build money for investment. So they called for tax cuts and less government economic regulation. The Democratic majority in Congress didn't approve of this. And to fight inflation, Ford urged Americans to shop wisely, to reduce spending, and he had a kind of a public relations campaign called WIN, Whip Inflation Now, W-I-N. It was a fairly lame attempt at ginning up a national movement. And although inflation fell, unemployment rose in 1975 to the highest level since the Depression. So domestically, Ford had a difficult time. He continued Nixon's policy of détente, and the United States signed an agreement with the Soviets at Helsinki that recognized the permanent division of Europe. And of course, as you all know, that all fell apart by 1989. The Helsinki Accords inspired movements for more freedom in Eastern European communist countries. Now, in the presidential election of 1976, Jimmy Carter, former governor of Georgia, narrowly defeated Ford. He was virtually unknown outside his state when he launched his campaign for the Democratic nomination, but realizing that Watergate and Vietnam had produced a crisis in confidence in the federal government, he turned his obscurity into an advantage. He ran as an outsider, making a virtue of the fact that he'd never held federal office. He had much in common with progressives of the early 20th century. His passions were making government more efficient, protecting the environment, raising the moral tone of politics. Unlike the progressives, however, he embraced the aspirations of African Americans and appointed an unprecedented number of African Americans to important positions. But the Democratic Party found itself ill-equipped to deal with the economic crisis. Although his party controlled both houses of Congress, Carter often found himself at odds with that same Congress. He viewed inflation, not unemployment, as the country's main economic problem. And to combat it, he promoted cuts in spending on domestic programs. In the hope that increased competition would reduce prices, his administration enacted deregulation in the airline and trucking industries, something that people think happened under Reagan, but actually happened under Carter. Carter also cut taxes for wealthier Americans and repealed usury laws. Right, so this definitely helped try to. Well, the idea was try to get more money into the economy. Inflation did not decline. Carter also believed that expanded use of nuclear energy could help reduce dependence on imported oil. But in 1979, that industry suffered near a fatal blow when an accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant east of us in Pennsylvania released a large amount of radioactive steam into the atmosphere. The 3 Mile Island mishap reinforced fears about the environmental hazards associated with nuclear energy and put a halt to the industry's expansion. So Carter seemed to be presiding over a period of national decline, and it was almost Ford and Carter. It was almost as if nobody could have done anything about it. This is a picture of the whip inflation now, sort of a flyer that you sent in. You wanted to join. This says, "Dear President Ford, I." You may not be able to read it, but it says, "Dear President Ford, I enlist as an inflation fighter and energy saver for the duration." The sort of wartime language. "I will do the very best I can for America." But this really didn't succeed. It never really caught people's imagination. Here is the presidential election of 1976, which Carter won. As you can see, the sort of the case where the parties realigned back the way they had. The Democrats win the South. Many Democrats who had moved to the right sort of trusted Carter, and they thought he was going to be different than other Democrats. And Carter was definitely a budget cutter, so he was seen as a new type of Democrat, like Clinton, and Clinton would later. And then he was able to win the election. Although again, this is a closer election, 297 electoral votes to 244 Ford. The deregulation of the airline industry under Carter produced lower fares, but also a drastic decline in service. Before deregulation, with prices kind of fixed, airlines sought to attract customers by providing good service in all classes. Okay, it was really something to fly on a plane. I flew on my first plane in the early 70s or the mid 70s, and it was really like a country club in the air. But deregulation brought fares down, okay, which certainly made flying more affordable, but passengers got jammed in like sardines and had to pay for checked luggage, had to pay for onboard meals and other amenities. So lots of people talk about the glory days of the old air travel, forgetting, of course, that prices had been very high. Now, here's a picture of the 3 Mile Island, where the accident there brought a halt to the industry's expansion. Now, let me talk about human rights, because one of the things that both Ford and Carter tried to use as accomplishments of their presidency was foreign affairs. So under Carter, a commitment to human rights defined U.S. foreign policy, perhaps for the first time. Human rights groups of the 1970s that influenced Carter began to identify human rights violations not only by communist nations, but also by U.S. allies, especially Latin American dictatorships that used death squads to kill political opponents. In 1978, Carter cut off aid to the military dictatorship in Argentina, which, in the name of anti-communism, had launched a dirty war against its own citizens. Okay. By his presidency's end, Carter had made human rights central to American foreign policy. He believed that in post-Vietnam USA, policy should move away from Cold War assumptions and instead combat third world poverty, prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and promote human rights. Carter also pardoned Vietnam-era draft resistors, which there was a huge backlash against that. Carter's emphasis on peaceful solutions to international problems brought some important results. In 1979, he brokered the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. He improved Latin American affairs by promising to transfer control of the Panama Canal in 2000. By 2000, it was agreed to them, and then it finally happened. It finally took place in 2000, a gradual period of time. He resisted calls to intervene against the left-wing revolution fighting Somoza, who was the dictator in Nicaragua. He also cut military aid to right-wing governments of El Salvador, which had sponsored death squads. But despite criticism from realists that his focus on human rights was damaging U.S. power in the world, Carter continued to pour billions into defense, and the United States also continued to support allies with records of human rights violations, such as Guatemala, such as the Philippines, such as South Korea and Iran. Here is a picture of Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin signing the 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Egypt at the time represented the largest Arab state, the richest Arab state, and had been sort of in the forefront of opposition to Israeli governments. Now, U.S. support for Iran undid Carter's policies and administration. Iran, which was strategically located on the Soviet Union's southern border, was a major supplier of oil and an importer of U.S. military equipment. Carter visited there in 1977, seemed to support the Shah of Iran, who was the ruler there, and it inspired militant opposition to not only the Shah, but to American involvement in Iran. And in 1979, a popular revolution led by the Muslim cleric Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah and declared Iran an Islamic republic. The Iranian Revolution marked a shift in opposition movements in the Middle East from socialism to Arab nationalism to religious fundamentalism. This had long-term consequences for the United States. When Carter allowed the deposed Shah to seek medical treatment in the United States, Khomeini's followers invaded the U.S. embassy and seized dozens of hostages. They eventually regained their freedom in January 1981 on the day that Carter's term ended, and the hostage crisis deeply hurt Carter's popularity. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 by the Soviets, who sought to reinforce a friendly government fighting an Islamic rebellion, also confronted Carter with a crisis. Over time, the Soviet war in Afghanistan proved to be its own Vietnam, with high casualties and costs and mounting domestic dissatisfaction. At first, however, it seemed to indicate a decline in U.S. power. In response, Carter announced the Carter Doctrine, declaring that the United States would use military force if necessary to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf. He retaliated against the Soviets with boycotts and with withdrawal from nuclear arms treaties. The U.S. also began to give arms and money to Islamic fundamentalist rebels in Afghanistan, which led to the rise of the Taliban, among other things. And in an unsuccessful attempt to bring down inflation, Carter abandoned the Keynesian economic policy of increased government spending and cut back on social spending and regulations, while projecting a major increase in the military budget. By 1980, the Cold War was reinvigorated in that way, and many of the conservative policies associated with Reagan, who'd come into office in 1981, were already in place under Carter. This is a picture of the American hostages in Iran. They're being paraded by their Iranian captors on the first day of the occupation of the American embassy in Tehran in 1979. Television gave extensive coverage to the plight of the hostages, leading many Americans to view the Carter administration as weak and corrupt. Okay, the other thing that happens in this period? Part of the idea that part of a response to the unraveling was the rising tide of conservatism. So, if we had a focus question for this section of the lecture, I'd like to call it, "What were the roots of the rise of conservatism in the 1970s?" Domestic and international troubles in the 70s made Americans anxious and emboldened, and they emboldened conservatism. Most prominently in the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment. Remember when I mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment and women's liberty in general is extremely important. Economic crisis made lower taxes, less government regulation, and social spending cuts to spur government investment made all those things seem appealing. And fears about declining U.S. power led to calls for renewing the Cold War. The civil rights and sexual revolutions produced fears and resentments that eroded the Democratic coalition, and rising urban crime created calls for law and order. In the 1970s, conservatives abandoned overt opposition to African American struggle for racial justice, as the confrontational style of George Wallace, the confrontational practices of George Wallace, were replaced by demands for local control and resistance to the federal government. The language of individual freedom appealed especially to growing numbers of mostly white suburbanites leaving the cities and their urban problems behind them. The suburbs became the base of the modern conservative movement. But conservatives also organized at the grassroots level and organized to win local elections and take local government, even school boards. One set of conservatives called neoconservatives turned against the federal government and liberalism, citing a decline in moral standards and respect for authority. They wanted to end welfare, decrease taxes and regulations, and return to fighting the Cold War. The rise of religious fundamentalism in the 1970s expanded conservatism's base. More and more Americans embraced traditional religious values. While membership in mainstream Protestant denominations declined, evangelical churches flourished. Evangelical Christians were alienated from a culture that seemed to discount religion and promote immorality. They demanded the reversal of Supreme Court decisions that banned prayer in public schools, protected pornography as free speech, and legalized abortion. In 1979, Jerry Falwell, a Virginia minister, created a group called the Moral Majority, and he created it to wage war against sin and elect pro-life, pro-family, pro-America candidates. Falwell labeled supporters of abortion rights, easy divorce, and reduced defense budgets as agents of Satan, trying to undermine God's plans for America. But conservative Christians seemed most angered by the sexual revolution, which they saw as an immoral threat to traditional families. They thought the 1960s had turned freedom into moral anarchy, and singer Anita Bryant, for instance, urged the passage of an anti-gay ordinance under the banner "Save Our Children." In the 1970s, family values became central to conservative politics, most prominently, as I said, in the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment. First proposed in the 1920s, the ERA was revived by second-wave feminists. Its affirmation that equality of rights under the law could not be abridged on account of sex seemed uncontroversial, and Congress approved it in 1972 with little controversy and sent it to the states for ratification. But it sparked protests from those who believed it would discredit the role of wife and homemaker. The ERA revealed divisions among women as well. To its supporters, the ERA guaranteed women's freedom in the public sphere, but to its opponents, freedom for women was in their roles as wife and mother. Opponents claimed that the amendment would erode male breadwinners' support for wives. And although polls show that most male and female Americans supported the ERA, it did not achieve the required ratification of 38 states in order to become law. Far more bitter was the battle over abortion rights, which was another example to conservatives of how liberals in office were spreading sexual immorality at the cost of moral values. A movement to reverse Roe versus Wade started among Roman Catholics, but soon included evangelical Protestants and social conservatives. The movement insisted that life began at conception and that abortion was murder. Feminists argued that a woman's right to control her own body included the right to safe, legal abortion. And you can't stress strongly enough how rigid the two sides were. Both sides showed how the rights revolution had reshaped political language as opponents of abortion, like I said, appealed to right for life, and supporters celebrated the right to choose. The anti-abortion movement successfully pressured Congress over President Ford's veto to end federal funding for abortions for poor women in the Medicaid program, and by the 1990s, some extreme anti-abortion activists were bombing medical clinics and assassinating doctors who terminated pregnancy. Today, most women continue to have legal right to the access of abortion, but it is always in contention. This is a picture of Phyllis Schlafly campaigning against the Equal Rights Amendment. You can see her down near the bottom of the picture in front of a bunch of signs that say "Stop the ERA." Right? She's leading a rally at the Illinois State Capitol. In 1978, she was instrumental in grassroots organization of conservative men and women in opposition to the proposed ERA, and she claimed that the amendment would take away the right to be a housewife. And the fact that the amendment has been defeated or more or less stopped over the years is a major victory for the conservative movement. This is a picture of a women's lib march in Detroit in 1970. Highlights the issue of equal pay for equal work. At the time, women earned less money than men in virtually every category of employment. That is still very true today. Here is an anti-abortion rally in Washington, D.C. in 1979 on the 6th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade, which barred states from limiting a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy. And here's a picture of supporters at a rally supporting abortion rights. And other states passed similar laws. New environmental regulations sparked calls for less government regulation of the economy, especially in the West, where the Sagebrush Rebellion sought to reduce federal bureaucracy's control over the conservation of land, water, and minerals. The roots of this rebellion lie far back as the 1920s, when the U.S. Forest Service announced plans to increase grazing fees and mineral rights in national forests and other public lands. Westerners who believed in environmental regulation were closing. Westerners who believed that environmental regulation were closing public domain to exploitation eagerly supported Reagan's campaign. Using the language of freedom from government tyranny, leaders in Western states embraced states' rights. And while the Sagebrush Rebellion had few concrete accomplishments, it underscored the rising tide of anti-government sentiment. By 1980, Carter was deeply unpopular. Conservatism seemed on the rise everywhere. In England, Margaret Thatcher was prime minister. She promised to sell state-owned industries to private firms to shrink the welfare state and reduce taxes and the power of unions. And in the United States, Ronald Reagan's campaign for the presidency united conservatives around promises to end stagflation and restore America's confidence and its role in the world. Reagan also appealed to white backlash against civil rights, voicing support for states' rights, vilifying welfare recipients, and condemning busing and affirmative action. Although not devout and a divorcee, the first one to ever be elected president, Reagan won the support of family values religious conservatives. Reagan won that election in 1980, taking former Democratic bastions such as Illinois, Texas, and New York, while Carter only received 41% of the vote. Okay, while Carter went on after his presidency to lead anti-poverty, human rights, and diplomatic efforts around the world, his presidency is considered by most to be a failure, and his defeat launched the Reagan Revolution. Now, here is Reagan when he was an actor and a spokesman for General Electric in 1958. There was General Electric had a sort of drama hour. It had it would promote these shows, and it would have its own commercials. And Reagan was not only the person who introduced the shows, he ran the ads too. He's showing how to use a GE oven. 1980, here's a picture of a Reagan supporter, delegate to the Republican National Convention of 1988. She wears a hat festooned with flags of the U.S. and of Texas, her state, and a button with a picture of her hero, Ronald Reagan. Now, we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that Reagan went right from being an actor to being president. He had been a leading Republican since the early 1960s. He was elected governor of California in 1966. He briefly ran for the Republican primary in 1968 against Nixon. And he continued to make himself known as a sort of the conscience of it, as this sort of standard bearer for conservative values throughout the 70s. And here is a map of that election. Right? You can see that it's quite an amazing landslide. 489 electoral votes to 49 electoral votes. Okay, landslide only bettered by Reagan's 1984 landslide. Okay, so this marks the end of what historians call the unraveling. Okay. And the rise of the Reagan presidency began what we might call contemporary American history.